Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Hope you're doing okay here. Today we're going to talk about some tips for faculty success for department chairs. Everybody up here is a department chair and is part of the FACMT Executive Committee. And why don't I do this? Why don't we first just go down the row, let everyone just introduce yourself, where you're from.
Are you going to have them? No.
Sure. Mike Brown. I'm the chair at Michigan State University, and welcome. Last year we had 2 small rooms, so we asked for a bigger room, and this is what we got.
I'm Andy Nugent. I'm from the University of Iowa.
Peter Sokolove, I'm the chair out at UC San Francisco, UCSF.
And Rich Hamilton, chair at Drexel in Philadelphia.
And Deborah Diercks, chair at UT Southwestern in Dallas.
Okay, so again, what we hope to do is just to try to share some thoughts with you about tips for success. And the way we set this up is we have a couple of cases that we thought we'd start with, but we really would like this to be interactive. So we're going to throw a case out there, maybe share some thoughts with you about this. Certainly feel free to jump in with your questions about that. And then I think we'd really like to have a little bit of time where just any questions that you have about how to be more successful as a faculty member, here's an opportunity with 5 folks who would love to be able to share, it's free advice, you get what you pay for, you know how that goes, but we're going to do the best we can. So let's start with this first case. So the first case is a scenario of, oh no, I've lost my funding. So Dr. Z is a productive assistant professor currently in the 5th year of a K award, who comes to the chair and sadly reports that her most recent grant application for an R01 has been denied. She feels that the grant will eventually be funded, but wants to know, is there any way the chair can provide some bridge funding until the new grant can be secured? So a few questions that arise about this. So first of all, from your perspective, this is to our panel here, what should she be doing prior to going to her chair? What factors do you consider as a chair when considering this request or similar requests? What specific tools or advice would you give her to be successful in moving forward? And finally, how might she best raise these concerns with her chair? So we'll go with that. And Andy, do you want to start first?
So for me, it's I'm kind of an entrepreneurial chair, so I kind of want to know the details when people come into the room. So the first advice I would give Dr. X or Z or wherever we're going with there is be prepared. So have your information. What did the NIH tell you on your grant? What was your score? How much money are you asking for? That's a big one because I have limited resources as a chair. What do you need the money for? So most places won't cover salary so much, but they will do the bridge funding to keep your lab people in place and your biostatisticians and whatever. And then when you come and talk about your NIH score, I want to know kind of the breakdown of that. Do they find it significant? Because if the significance score is really low, then they're probably not going to fund it down the road. But if it's really high, then I'm really interested in giving you money because I know you're eventually going to get funded. So that's good for the department. It's good for everybody. And really the idea is to have a temporary source of money so an established research plan will eventually get funded. And we want to keep those people in business as much as we can. I don't know if anybody else has some thoughts down here. There's another mic.
I got the other mic. All right. So I think this really is a great question, and although it's focused on a K, it's really focused on you had a deal, and the deal's over, right? That's really kind of what it is. And so I think there's a couple ways to approach it, and I think one of the ways is acknowledge that the deal is over, and you maybe didn't meet the metrics, right? Be honest. I didn't get funded. It's over. But you have to also recognize that when you had a deal, someone invested a lot in you. So it is a huge investment for someone to get a K. It's a huge investment for someone to give you protected time. So they've already put money into you, so they kind of want you to win. And so I think if you go in and things don't work out, acknowledge that, you didn't meet the expectations to keep the deal. Have a timeline on how much you're asking for more deal, and have outcomes for it. And you have to realize at some point, you're just going to have to say, all right, I didn't get it. I'm back to normal. But I think, I think the key is people have already invested in you to give you your deal. If you're asking for more, put a timeline on it. Because that way your chair knows that you're willing to, you're not asking for this forever. You're just asking for it until you can get that bridge funding. I like Andy's component. Do your homework. In the situation of bridge funding, know which emergency medicine foundations give bridge funding and have a plan to apply for it. And I think if you kind of do those, go in with how you're going to help get to the next step, I think it really is a kind of it's a much easier conversation. The conversations that aren't easy are the, hey, my K's not funded, I need more money. And you look at them and you're like, okay, like I need more money. Okay.
I would just say one comment about this. I agree with both of the comments that have been made from both ends of the table here. I think for all chairs, when you're thinking about making investments like this and many other investments, you're thinking about, you want to see effort, you want to see promise, and you want to see a plan. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to. So first of all, what's the effort? So, how much effort was put into writing this R? And, was it did they do it in their 5th year of their K only? But did they also try it in year 3 and in year 4? I mean, to do this, you got to take multiple shots on goal to be successful, right? Getting funded as a researcher is very, very hard. So what sort of effort has been put into it to give you a sense of how much drive that individual has? What's the promise of this? Is this an area that's likely to get funded or not? Do they have appropriate collaborators? Does this look like you put a lot of money into it, as Deb said? I mean, you maybe put $500,000 of salary support into somebody over a 5-year K. You kind of don't want that to just go out the window. You definitely want them to be successful, to Deb's point. On the other hand, you don't want to keep throwing good money after bad if it's not going to be successful. So what's the effort? What's the promise? And part of the promise is that plan, right? What does the plan look like? Where are you going to submit to? What are your timelines? All the things that were mentioned. Yeah.
And I'll just say, if you don't have a plan, the chair will have a plan for you. And that plan might be that you increase your clinical workload and seek out an opportunity to get a new direction in your research and find a new way to get funded, which would unfortunately require some sweat equity. Your clinical workload will go up. Perhaps there'll be another role that you can step into. But then if you're going to really pursue that research goal, you're going to have to invest in yourself with time that goes beyond the, over and above.
Okay, and I think if you have questions about that particular scenario, just hold that thought for a few minutes. We're going to do a second scenario, and then I'll take this mic out to the audience afterwards, and we'll get some questions from you. So the second scenario has to do with a request for more administrative responsibilities. So Dr. Y is an assistant professor. He works clinically 13 shifts per month. He also leads 2 preclinical courses in the medical school, and he mentors 3 residents and 2 fellows. So a pretty busy guy. His department chair has requested that he lead the department's new QI program. Dr. Y feels he has been a good citizen and has been a good contributor to the program and willing to pitch in the short term, but feels this request is unreasonable and may potentially jeopardize his ability to pursue other creative projects or interests. However, he does not know how to communicate his concerns to his chair in a productive way. And so he would like to seek some advice to come to a mutually agreeable outcome with his chair. So the questions are, from the panel, what advice do you have for Dr. Y? What would be helpful for him to do prior to the meeting with the chair? And what arguments can he use to respectfully discuss and maybe decline this offer, which may be hazardous?
Well, I'll go first. So I have been Dr. Y, and I have said yes a lot. And that has had a negative impact on a lot of components of my career. But the reason I said yes was that I really began to understand what the chair's issue was and how I could help the chair solve this problem. So the first thing I would say is to my chair, Dr. Diercks, what is it that you see for this position? What is the problem you're trying to solve? What's your vision for the QI position? What are the issues? Why have you come to me? Is it because you feel my talents are suited for this, or do you feel like this is part of my development? I would really want to really begin to see it from the chair's perspective, what my chair thinks, what she has in her mind about why she's asking me to do this job. And if I don't get a great answer, if it's like, well, so-and-so won't do it, and I thought of you next, then I do start thinking about maybe this is just going to be something that's really not good for my development. It'll just be, it's my turn or something. And I really have to start thinking about how I'm going to decline that offer. Good ways to decline it are to ask how many hours a week the chair thinks the job would be. And if the chair believes it would be a couple of hours per week, then something goes into your Outlook calendar, something has to come out. And so then you would ask the chair, what would you like me to stop doing? You know, I'm doing A, B, or C. Which of these is not a priority for you? That would be one way to go about it. The other way is to try to do a buy down of clinical time. Say, all right, I'm happy to do it, but something has to go. How many clinical hours would you be willing to cut back so that I can take on this new role? And all chairs have a formula for that. Some of them are very similar. I think some are different. Often I will allocate time based on the steady state effort of the job, not the first month or the first 6 months, but you know, over time in a year, how much it's going to take you on a per week basis to do this. Sometimes I have, for example, I expect everybody to do a few hours of administrative function every week. And if you're not doing anything, then taking on this role would really, in my mind, be no reduction in your clinical time or any of these other efforts. So those are the kind of ideas. You put yourself in the chair's position and ask the chair what his or her vision is about this position and why they've tapped you to be the person to do it, and start to understand it from their point of view. And if you're not getting, if you're getting sponsored and mentored into the new role, then you really better think about saying yes. The flip side is that if you're being given the job because it's just the chair once it gets it off their desk, then start thinking about ways of saying no.
I would just add that your chair's got their own motivations, and for you to say yes is a big relief. And they may not, he or she may not show that when you're in the office. They're probably going to go whew, as soon as you say yes. So this is your chance to renegotiate. And like Rich was saying, if you think that takes a few hours a week, then by all means negotiate with your chair. They brought you in for a purpose, right? To give you this job because they didn't want to do it or they don't have anybody to do it. And they obviously feel like you're capable of doing it. So use that to your advantage. I'm probably giving away a trade secret, but it's
hand that down. So just a couple thoughts. One is I would look, if someone was in my office, I would also look at it in terms of promotion, because sometimes they have done a lot in terms of teaching. This individual is involved in the undergraduate medical curriculum, mentoring residents, fellows, so they're really doing well on the educational front. Let's say they've done some research as well, but the service, that's how our promotion criteria is set up. There's this third component of service, and maybe they're weak there. So this, in that sense, might be an opportunity for them, and I might say, just do this for a couple years. You can check that box on your promotion packet, and maybe you'll love it, maybe you'll hate it, but give it a try.
Yeah, so I think sometimes it's hard for somebody to read our minds on what we really want. So I think from your own perspective, so I think when you go into these kind of discussions, it really helps to kind of really clearly articulate what you're doing in all the academic pillars that Mike said. So your chair may not know you're mentoring 5 people. May not have any idea because maybe you're doing it outside of, and a lot of things we don't know sometimes those granular details. So let them know, hey, I appreciate the offer. I'm doing, for education, I'm giving 2 lectures, mentoring 5 people for, research. I'm in this stuff, and now you want me to do this. Help me figure out how I can do all that. And the chair may say, look, for a promotion, you don't have to do 5 people mentoring. Is that important to you? If it's not really high on your thing and you think you're doing it because your chair wants to, that's a great time to have a discussion to balance what you do with your chair's expectation. I think the most interesting discussions I think I have with faculty are when they come in and like, I'm doing all this, and I'm like, why? And like, because I thought you wanted me to. And I'm like, not really. You know, so really having that kind of, what's your priority and how can we get to a balance? Asking for protected time it makes all of us cringe a little bit, especially if it's unfunded protected time, because we have to figure out where that funding's coming from. And so I think if you're going to ask for it, kind of really you got to sell why you can't fit that into your day. And I'll be honest, we will never probably give you as much protected time as you think you need to do your job, because we just don't have the funds to do it.
It's always less protected.
It's always less. It's always
I guess I wanted to, I really agree with those great points. Thanks, Deb. The other thing I was just going to say is, I think from a stylistic standpoint, when you're having these discussions with your chair, it's important to really frame it as allies, not adversaries, if that makes sense. You want to avoid at all costs having it be it's me versus you. I need this, and you have that, and you got to give me this. And it's much more about the sitting side by side than sitting across the table and saying, hey, Chair, I need your help. I need your advice. This is what I have on my plate. These are all these things, and I'm wondering how I could fit this in. What things should I keep or not doing, or how would you, how can I help work on getting this time? And really thinking more as allies, because your chair does want you to be successful, and they want you to have balance, and they want you to have happy careers. And at the same time, there's also the reality that your chair has, a certain amount of funds. It's a limited amount of funds. They're there to be stored for the entire group, not just for one individual, right? And so I think the more you can, whenever you're having these discussions with your chairs, frame them in the, we're working together sort of mode of discussion, you're going to get a lot further with it than trying to make it as adversaries. So just leave it with that.
Yeah, I'm going to just talk a few seconds on my way to the audience. So I want you to think about your question, because I'm going to go out and give you an opportunity here. Just a thought, if you did accept that role as QI director, this is something I've suggested to faculty, because we talked about how the question of how much time it's going to take, and no one really knows, especially this is a new role. So I tell faculty to keep a log. It's not required, but there's a nice, Excel spreadsheet for an activity log, and I've served me well over the years. Way back, even as associate program director, I kept a log, and you know what? At one point, the program directors said to me, "Well, what are you doing with all your time?" And I said, "Here, this is what I've been doing." And so I just think it protects you, and then it also gives you an opportunity to monitor, because if it's taken a lot more time than what you were initially anticipated, you can go to the chair and say, look, this job is way more than what we kind of talked about when we met. It's just a little tip, I guess. So questions from the audience on those scenarios, and then we'll also open it up to questions in general. Raise your hand. Got a couple? Okay. And you could say where you're from, just to...
Yeah, so I'm John Whiteman. I'm the new chair at Uniformed Services University. So it's kind of a piggyback on the same question. So as a new chair, I've got faculty members who were promised a certain percentage of stuff from the previous chair. It's not perfectly in line with kind of my goals and objectives. So, is there differences or there are subtleties on how they'll probably be interested from a faculty perspective, but from the chair's perspective also, just how to maybe negotiate that if it's any different than what you've already talked about.
Yeah, you can take the approach of that you're the new sheriff in town and just, renegotiate every deal. But I do think that does not, in the long run, that does not work well. It's not the tone you want to set when you want to get started. And I think it's important to create a transition plan from the prior agreement to the new, what your vision is. And so when I became chair, that's what I did. I said, all right, you're going to remain in this role for a year, and then my expectation is you're going to do A, B, or C, or D. And that allowed people to kind of get the elbow room to, breathing room to think about things a little bit. And a lot of the conflicts that I had with these prior roles kind of dissipated over that time as people began to reinvent themselves and rethink of things.
So it's funny, deals look differently depending on where you are in your career. To the junior faculty, everyone's got too good a deal, right? Especially if they're in the leadership roles and had the deals from the prior chair. And so one of the things, I mean, I walked into, when I became a chair 4.5 years ago, I walked into a lot of deals. A lot of deals that I couldn't figure out and didn't make any sense. And so one of the things, first things I did was I had a group of faculty look at how much protected time certain roles should have. And then we looked at how much protected time people were actually given and worked in our transition plan so we could have a transparent way to tell people how much time they're going to get. That made, in my mind, it did not make some faculty happy, right? But I think overall as a group, it allowed us to be much more transparent because we had set expectations for certain roles and kind of leveled the playing field that was really not that level when I arrived.
I was just going to, I agree with, again, all those comments. I think you have to be very thoughtful about the timelines on which you address these things. I think it's very important as a chair that you're equitable in the way you treat people, and that means that you do need to have an independent, you know, whether it's through a group of faculty, through yourself, through your cabinet, kind of assessment of the state of things and understand what things you want to change and what things you don't. Obviously, as a new chair, you don't want to walk into a department and upend, you know, every single thing unless it really needed to be upended that quickly. But I think, you know, it's kind of like one of those graphs. It depends how inequitable something is the urgency of the timeline. There are some things where you walk in and you go, man, this just cannot stand. This is not appropriate. A classic example is, you know, you're eating your young, as they say, right? The junior faculty are working all the nights and all the hours and all of this, and the senior faculty, you know, if you get something that's really completely inequitable, I think you have to have a shorter timeline to really address it. And you got to explain why and what the principles are about why you're making changes. But, you know, all of these things, sometimes there's a reason that the person before you had made an agreement, and you just need to try to understand what that was first. Maybe, you know, maybe there's something that they understood that you just didn't put in your equation yet. But I think being equitable as a chair is probably the single most important thing that you can do.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I'd just say make it apply to everybody if you're going to apply to one, if you got a system for that. The easiest thing is if the dean says you have to get rid of all of it, because then you just blame it on the dean, right? And so, and then start over. But we have these great benchmarks, particularly in the chairs group, for what various jobs should do and what people get across the country. And sometimes you can use that data in the annual review process. And I think the second point I would say is, you know, just take your time. Nobody has to go in there in the first day and take away everybody's protected time. And, you know, it might cost you a little money to do this over 6 months or a year, but you'll get there if you make people just kind of spell out what they need to do. And one of the things I've been successful with is I made everybody rewrite their job description. And by the time they're done with the job description and we've proved it, it's a lot like what Deb said. Then you have a good idea of how many hours it should take.
Okay, let's get another question. Great.
I'm Scott Dresden from Northwestern University. My question is kind of related to scenario B, I guess, where a chair is asking a junior or a mid-career faculty to step into a new role. And there seems to be a balance there between listening to the chair's wishes for that role and also the junior or mid-career faculty advocating for themselves and clearly defining that role for what they can do. Do you guys have any advice on that very nebulous balance I just described to you?
Yeah, there's a good method that I use and it has been successful in situations like that is I will send to Dr. Y a job description, the job description that I have. And I say, take a look at this and edit it or make additions or subtractions to it and then send it back to me. And then we'll go back and forth with the job description so that we can really sort of define what it is that I want and you want, and we can do it mutually so that you understand what I'm thinking. And that process, the thought process of doing that, also takes the interaction from, you know, a 30-minute to 1-hour meeting in your office on a busy day to a couple of weeks and allows both parties to kind of really think it through. And I've had many times I'll say to somebody, look, this is only a few hours a week. I want you to get after this. And going back and forth I've come to the realization that what I am asking is either way more than that or has an aspect that I didn't appreciate. So asking for a job description and then having an extended conversation over what that job actually is, I think could be very helpful.
I like the job description idea because it changes it from you're asking me to do something I don't have time for to I'm looking at what you're asking as part of the job and the time you're allotted doesn't match what I think it would take to do these tasks. So then you've really depersonalized it, and it's no longer you, chair, it's that you're working with the chair to figure out how to do what that you can do on that list in the time they're allotted. And that really takes it away. It takes the kind of discomfort around the conversation out and allows you to come up with a description that matches time, which is really all we all want to do, right? We want to make sure that we're adequately reimbursed for the time, with time protection for the job we're asked to do.
I completely agree with that. I was going to say, make a general comment about clinical time versus administrative time too. I mean, again, at least from my perspective, others can feel free to chime in. A clinical hour is different than an administrative hour, right, or a teaching hour. We all know 2 a.m., draining an abscess, whatever it is, is different than, sitting in your office having a meeting or being able to maybe do something on your laptop from home and things like that. So there really shouldn't be an expectation, at least in my mind, of a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So if you do a 12-hour a month clinical job, administrative job, one wouldn't expect to have a 12-hour a month reduction in your clinical activities. At least in my mind, that doesn't make sense because the reality is administrative work, while it's hard and while it's important, and we all do a lot of that, it's not the same as when you're there at 3 a.m. dealing with the stress of a family and patients and resuscitations and things like that. So there's some ratio. It may be different, and that ratio may vary depending on what that new role, for example, is going to do for your career. If you're going to be the scheduler and you're going to make the schedule and that's it, that's not a lot of high academic yield, right? It may help you on more operational roles, but it's not a high academic yield. If it's a role with the School of Medicine, boy, that has a lot of academic yield. You tend to get a lot better, more output from your merits, your promotions, things like that. So, but I do think it's important to have realistic expectations around those sort of ratios and thinking about that. And sometimes you can even ask your chair. You could say, I think we agree this is going to take about 12 hours a month to do this. I mean, so how do you think that translates into clinical time from your perspective? And have some discussion around that so you can understand it. Anyway.
Yeah, I was going to add to that then. So I have a ratio that we use, and it's like 1.5. You can argue whether that's the right ratio, wrong ratio. And this is someone that values research and teaching tremendously. So, but like, the panel was saying, sitting at Journal Club, doing something you love to do is not the same as working a clinical shift in a busy ED on Saturday evening. So most of the time that works. It's a ratio I've used for years, and it seems to be satisfactory because the people that want to do academics seem to be okay with that, and so the supply and demand seems to fit.
I use the same ratio. And so a couple of facts that we use. So only a third of emergency medicine shifts are Monday to Friday during business hours. When I report hours to the dean, if I have a clinical faculty member that works 24 clinical hours, I tell the dean that person works 6 sessions a week. And for the time, that's 6 4-hour sessions. That way the medicine-trained, pediatrics-trained dean understands what that time load is. I give an 1.5 for the nights and weekends. So the fact that you look at your schedule and you have a Monday day shift, a Tuesday middle, and a Wednesday overnight, when I report your clinical time, I'm plussing that up by 1.5 to account for that Tuesday middle and that Wednesday night. I also give you an hour after every shift to chart. Flip side is I expect 2 freebie hours a week of admin time, 2 freebie hours a week of teaching. I don't expect you to for me to buy those from you, if you will. But I use 1.5 in the same way that you do. So if you say I have a meeting on Friday from noon to 2 with this committee every month, That's not 2 hours of emergency medicine time.
I think a key number for y'all to remember is 2,080. That is the number of hours that that our bosses and that people who don't do emergency medicine expect you to work. That's 40 hours a week for 52 weeks. You can take some vacation out of that, but that 2,080 is what everyone talks about, and we get nowhere close to that. Matter of fact, most emergency physicians work 1,400 is kind of an average for clinical. So when you're talking to somebody, especially somebody outside emergency medicine, and say, I work 3 shifts a month, they don't think you work at all. And so when we use that kind of term to equate to how much you work, we are grossly underestimating the amount of time we spend. And people who do not do our job do not get it. And so I think I always get a little nervous when someone says, well, I did what are you talking about? I came in and worked. And I'm like, you worked your shifts. But we're telling everybody else you're doing a bunch more, because otherwise you wouldn't be a full-time FTE. And so to a chair, work time includes your clinical shifts plus the admin time we're promising someone you're doing on a daily basis. And so when you ask for, like they all said, there's a ratio there because our bosses think that you're all working 2,080 hours, and we have to kind of sell that you're doing the clinical plus something else.
I'm going to...
I have a question. Is anybody a nocturnist out there? You're a nocturnist. How many, so just, yeah, thank you. Thank you. So in our shop, I don't know how many hours you work, but in our shop, a full-time nocturnist is around 1,200 hours. And that's because you basically get 1.5 times that credit for the clinical workload, and then you back out vacation and this and that and the free stuff that I ask you to do on a fairly regular basis, and that's a full-time nocturnist. A full-time clinician is like 1,536. A full-time clinical educator is in the mid-1300s. So those are numbers that, chairs have to live and die with, and then go up to the C-suite and explain to somebody from another specialty why 24 clinical hours a week, is full-time.
Yeah, I mean, just to summarize one thing, I would say, I think what you're hearing is that chairs think about your time in various ways, right? And that when you're asked to do an administrative duty or take on a task, the first kind of ballpark question is this already built into the time that you've been given, or is this big enough that it requires something extra, right? It may be a small enough thing that your chair just says, you know what, we really can't negotiate over about additional hours because this is built in. This is part of those difference between your clinical hours and the 2080 or even higher, what you really need to be successful in academic medicine, right? And then if it is something that's bigger, then it's really trying to figure out how big is it, what's the amount involved, is there a ratio, those sort of things. The other thing I just want to say, beyond time, there's some other things important when you're taking on a new role, which is to make sure that you have the support you need to do that role. There are other things other than dollars and hours. There may be some administrative support. There may be some special training you need. Maybe you need to do some, go to a QI conference or whatever it is. Get some special, experiences before taking on this new role. And those are also very important parts of the equation that you shouldn't minimize as well. It's not just about the time and the money and hours, those sort of things, but it's about making sure you're successful in that role so that it really is something both successful for you and the department.
I want to just open it up if that's okay. So we had, last time we did this, we didn't have enough time at the end for general questions, and so I want to do that now. We have another scenario that we can present, but we don't want to get cut short at the end. So I want to open it up right now. Are there any other questions that you'd like to ask the panel of chairs? It may not relate to the scenarios we just presented, and that's fine.
And by the way, you look very anonymous to us here. We have lights in our eyes, okay? So we're not going to know. So ask away.
Thank you very much for sitting on the panel. Chris Good, I'm a new chair at West Virginia University. So in relation to that scenario, another thing that I have approached it with is taking something off of their plate that someone else is passionate about. Because we all know that the triple threat, educator, researcher, clinician, is really hard to find. But it's our job as the chairs to ensure that the department is the triple threat. So do you approach it from that aspect as well? you know, if you're finding a specific job for somebody you think that they're well qualified for, to take something else off of their plate and reassign it to someone else in the group.
Yeah, I've groomed a couple of my faculty into department chairs. And to answer your question, there comes a time when you need to address an area that you've not been that interested in. So if you've been a high-powered research person, have done really well there, you might have to get some clinical operational experience. And being the QI person, or adding a piece where you're running, you know, maybe a new enterprise within a department is something you don't want to do. But if you want to develop into a chair, you're going to need to demonstrate that ability. And the flip side might be you may have been too operational, and you really need to develop your academic portfolio. So yes, the triple threat is the ideal scenario. I think the mistake people make is thinking they have to be at all times in all three of those directions. And a good career develops appropriately in each of those phases.
I mean, I think those are really great shared decision-making discussions, and I love your comment that a triple threat doesn't exist. I have like a TED-like talk on academic medicine, and I say we're kind of like a tripod on rocky terrain, where each leg can go up and down, and you move each leg to keep balanced and to keep your tripod up. And I think if we think about life that way, it's so much easier to handle, to realize that you may have some years where you have no research funding. So your clinical time and your focus on education or administration may go up. Or you have something and you're given an administration opportunity, and so something else has to go down. And I think those are really good, honest discussions, but they are hard because you, as the faculty, have to be really honest about what your priority is and what you're willing to give up, or you're going to continue to do it because you love it so much, even if it means adding to your plate. But those are great, you know, those aren't me versus you. Those are let's talk together, because I know that you can't do everything. I know there's only 24 hours in a day. So how do we make all this fit for you? And those are kind of fun discussions when somebody wants to take on more. It's much easier to do that than when you have to give somebody something.
More questions? Oh, yeah, we got some more questions. Do they have a mic?
Yeah. No, sorry. We've got one question in the back, and then he'll bring the mic up here. We have a ambassador helping us.
Thank you. Fantastic. You can come back up.
So I like my current job. I'm not necessarily married to it in the long term. And how do I potentially look for other jobs without alienating my current chair?
So this happens to us in Iowa all the time because we're kind of a starter place, and then people move on. So it honestly, we've been around the block long enough that we know people are going to move and they're going to look for things. The worst thing you can do is hide it. I think if you want to go on elsewhere, a lot of times, if you be honest with us and come talk to us about it, we'll help you. Because it's far better for you to be a happier faculty than it is to be unhappy and on our faculty, if that makes any sense.
I have a little list of aphorisms, and one of them, it's on an index card, and one of them says, someone always wants to leave, but somebody always wants to come. And so it doesn't surprise a chair when someone walks in the office and says, you know, I'm thinking about a new direction. Seek the chair's help. They will most definitely help you out. If they're worth their salt, they will definitely help you out.
I mean, it's not a loss to us, right? Because usually if it's, I think, you know, I want to become a chair. So we get to spend effort developing you to get those skills, but you're also benefiting the department while you gain them. So there always is advantage on on elevating people, because they do provide valuable input to the department they're in until they decide to leave. And if you let somebody know, it lets us prepare who's going to be that next person we get to elevate because a position gets opened.
I think one other way to just like frame this and start those sort of discussions is just talking about career goals, right? Not the where, but the what. What do you want to do? What are the types of activities you want to do? Sometimes that will give you opportunity within your own department, right? And you'll be built up. Sometimes it'll become obvious that that's not going to happen, right? Let's say you want to be the program director, you've been the assistant program director, a new program director was just named, they're probably not going to leave anytime soon. It might become obvious that if that's what your actual goal is, it might have to be somewhere else, and have your chair help you with that. I mean, unless your chair is just like somebody that you just cannot have a conversation with, which we know these chairs, and I don't think the chairs of emergency business medicine are those types of people, but unless there was something really extreme, you want to be able to have your chair be your champion. When someone becomes a department chair, it's not about advancing their career anymore. It's about advancing their faculty's careers. And hopefully that means wonderful career development at your own shop, but sometimes it means not. Sometimes it means you take them to a certain point and they go somewhere else. And you know what? Sometimes they come back again in a different role. So I think you should, it is uncomfortable, I understand, because of the power differential. There's this fear that if I say something, something bad's going to happen. But if you really frame it around mentorship, career mentorship, what you want to do in your career, and you'll get a sense and know who your chair is. And as you get to know your chair more, those conversations become more and more comfortable. And then sometimes it does evolve just being very specific about, wow, I want to look at this other position out here. And the more open you can be, I think, the better.
Yeah, we have another question up here.
And I'll say we like to travel around a lot, so if you're in another town, we'll stop and get a beer. It's all great, just so you know.
Thank you. This is incredibly helpful. My name is Lorna Breen. I'm from Columbia University in New York. And something that I'm always curious about, and this is a perfect place, I think, to ask it, is I think that a lot of us, I'm a mid-career attending, I'm a medical director, I know the pressures that my boss is under as it pertains to our department, staffing the department, having happy docs, the obvious stuff. But the stuff I always wonder about is what are the pressures that she's under that I don't know about? And I know it's different at every shop, obviously. But what I'm hearing, this 2080, this is the third time this month I've heard that you all have to go to people that we don't know and talk about how little we actually work. And so this is becoming, in my mind, sort of a universal truth. A universal truth of being a chair is you all are asked by people we don't know to defend our lack of clinical time. I'm curious to know if you'd be willing to share any other, maybe like top 3 universal truths of chairs that people who work in your department may not know or understand, and it might be helpful to us to know what you go through in those board meetings that we're never in.
I'll just throw one or two. The 2080 thing obviously has happened to all of us, but the worst thing that can, not the worst thing, but one of the things that bothers me is if I go into a group of other chairs within the college, and then somebody points at me and says, this happened last week in your department, and it becomes very personal. And those kind of conversations are uncomfortable. I don't really care for those too much. I suppose that's one of the bad parts about being a chair.
I'll throw one out there. Just recent, but our dean has certain expectations of the in-kind contribution in terms of teaching the medical students. And so we have to have that conversation. And sometimes it's kind of like what we said. I have to show the dean, look, this is what we're doing. Some of it's not readily apparent because they might not be a course director, but our faculty are all engaged in maybe simulations and other forms of in-kind contributions to the mission of the medical school. So that's an example of something you might not be aware of, but I have to have those discussions and have that pressure to show our value to the dean.
So I'll just mention a few quick things. That's a great question, by the way. So first of all, I think universally all chairs worry about the budget, right? Worry about the money. We want to be able to pay our faculty. We want to pay them well. We want to recruit them, retain them, have them be happy, and we never want to have to reduce anyone's salary. So I think the amount of time that folks in chair positions spend thinking about how do I make sure that I never have to reduce a salary can't be underestimated. No one ever wants to have to do that. And so we think a lot about revenue growth versus expense growth and where are those curves and are they getting close to crossing and how do we keep them from crossing? How do we keep the revenue up? How do we keep the expenses down? How do we, I think we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think certainly myself, when I was a junior faculty member particularly, I just kind of assumed, well, hey, I'm working hard and I'm doing my job, so of course I'm going to get paid. Well, if your chair has the money, of course you're going to get paid, but we spend a lot of time making sure we have the money. So I think that's something we spend a lot of time on. The other thing I'll say, and this is maybe a little different angle, is when your chair has to make decisions about things, they can't always share all of the information with you on how a decision was made. And that's really hard because, you know, we want the validation. We want the buy-in. We want people to feel that they've been heard and part of decision-making. No one wants to be a monarch in these roles, right? But sometimes there are confidential things that you can't mention. Something, you know, personnel issue around a faculty member or something, you know, there's a whole host of these things. And so, you know, just like we all, you know, I think it's a good philosophy of life is to just try to give each other the benefit of the doubt. That sometimes you have to realize you're not going to have every piece of information for why a decision was made, and you have to feel a little comfortable that hopefully your chair is making the best decisions on behalf of not themselves, but the group, not the individual faculty, but the group. And that's kind of what we're asked to do. So I'd say that's another thing. And the last thing I would just say about, I think, is that as chairs, we oftentimes play roles in our health system as well, right? So we have our department hat where we're advocating for the department and thinking about the department. But we have this other part where we sometimes have to check our department hat at the door and be, you know, a member of our, you know, health system governing board or things about that, where you have to make strategic decisions or votes or input that sometimes can be, I don't want to say at odds with your department, but maybe it's not the same priority as your department, and that is another part of what we have to do for our roles.
Great question. Two comments. One, sometimes we are defending the whole concept of academic emergency medicine, literally the whole concept. And I'm not kidding when I say that I've been in multiple situations where I have to sit down with someone who says, we think we can do the whole thing with a contract medical group and get rid of the residency and add $1 million to the bottom line. And your response to that is like, you know, like, God, where do I start? Like the earth cooled, a crust formed on it. Man began walking around the universe, and, you know, I mean, like, how far back in time do you want me to go to say that academic emergency medicine matters? So that is, you know, you literally would go from that meeting to a meeting with Dr. Wise saying, like, wow, I don't think I can do the QI job. You're like, just take the job, damn it. The other thing is that, and I get this a lot, in fact, recently I very proudly submitted all of our research to the dean as part of our annual report, and the response I got was, most of your work is unfunded. And, you know, that doesn't hit the faculty. You know, the things that everybody's doing that is great stuff, that is really developmental to your career, those first 3 or 4 papers that are not funded, we have to defend that, amazingly. That we have to say, like, no, this is somebody who I think is going to be eligible for some grants or contracts or support. So amazingly, all the things that we believe in and that we look on as successes, we often are up in the C-suite defending them from the pressures of turning emergency medicine back into a 100% clinical enterprise.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the key is that most of us have to figure out how to manage 2 masters. You have your medical group, which is your funds flow, your clinical productivity metrics, are you getting the surgeons, patients in, because even though you're boarding 50% of your beds, that we end up defending a lot of time. So that's really one group, and that's the budget, that's the, you know, you got to get your allies, you have to make everyone see the environment you're working in. The other side is the academic side, and that's the school medicine side or the dean's office side. And those two sometimes talk, sometimes not. And that's really those discussions on, hey, we aren't medicine, and we aren't giving formal didactics on biochemistry to the students, but we teach 250 of them a year, and you're not giving us anything. And so how do we get funding for the clinical time, you know, the clinical teaching we do? And how do we elevate our faculty so that they're known, so they can go up? And I think those are 2 different areas that we really have to advocate for our departments on a lot. People think it's kind of one happy family. Well, the money of the health system and the dean's office and the school of medicine aren't always aligned. And we as kind of chairs have to make sure that we can navigate that to make sure that we do have the salaries like Peter mentioned, have the protected time to teach, and so we can make sure that our faculty, who are judged on balancing everything perfectly, never feel the difference in the malalignment between those two groups.
I'll do a wrap-up here because we're just about done, and I'm so happy we didn't have to go to the 3rd scenario because you had such great questions. And I wanted to say one thing on behalf of the AACEM. We are just one slice of the pie you heard from. What I've learned being part of this organization of chairs in emergency medicine is that these chair jobs are all different, and it's really quite astounding. There's a lot of overlap, like you've heard, but they're all different. And so if you had a different panel of 5 chairs, some of the responses might have changed. So you do have to figure out what's your system like. What are their challenges? So hopefully we've reached some of the objectives and given you a few tips. We said at least 3 tips. Hopefully it was more than that. But really thank you for your attention and excellent questions.